last thing I'll say about the work we're doing on policy is the whole sustainability issue. It's ridiculous to expect communities with extremely little resources, without local business structures in some cases, with a moving population in the case in Tanzania, to be able to sustain a broadcaster wholly themselves. So we've looked at also regulation in terms of support mechanisms from the growing commercial sector, or cross-subsidization training fee that would be put into some kind of fund. We're also looking at trying to get import tax and customs duties on equipment lowered, that sort of thing. And I think the work's gone well. We were sort of overtaken by telecoms. We're trying to catch up, and we'll keep doing that over the next few years. I think the other thing you asked me about was in terms of technology. The three communities that we're working with in this pilot project, they're extremely remote. They're not hooked up to the national power plants, so there's no electricity. There are no phone lines. One of them has a HF radio call system. And so in terms of getting them connected, for the radio equipment, that was fine. But then another element of it was getting onto email, internet. So we had to look around for options or solutions that would work. And of course, everyone is sort of, the main equipment providers are selling this thing. Satellite is the solution, but the regulation isn't in place in our countries yet for that to happen. And the cost will still be extremely high for the communities to come online. So what we looked at was, again, adapting systems that communities were already using. In Tanzania, they were using HF radio, and we looked around and found that there was one ISP in the region that was dealing with HF radio connectivity, and it seemed to be working. It's been used in the Great Lakes just after the genocide, and it's also been used in Western Uganda by a health network. So we're looking at getting them connected and solving the lack of telephone line question with HF radio, and looking at the lack of electricity by using solar. And an interesting fact came up when we were looking around at that, which is more rural areas in Kenya actually have solar power than are actually on the government's rural electrification plan, which has been in place for the last, almost 20 years since independence, which is terrible. But I mean, solar is a viable option, so that's what we're looking at using. And I think the message behind all of that is all media is just a tool, and the communities have demonstrated that there are ways you can, depending on what your need is, you can find a way. I think what we need to do as networks of supporting organizations or for community media is to really start lobbying the equipment providers and really start lobbying for appropriate solutions, not just to look down-term. We don't think HF radio is a long-term solution, but it solves an immediate and medium-term need. And I think in the long term, we have to make sure that the developments in technology work with the conditions on the ground, and to push for that. And I think that's something that we can very easily take up if we're a bit more creative in our approach.
That was wonderful. You hit all the important points. We're looking pretty good. This camera has really bad focal length. All right, so why don't we start with that? If you could just tell me your name, and I'm going to just swing this a little bit for the light. Your name and what organization you work with.
All right. My name's Chuck Scott. I was the sort of founding chairperson of the Open Window Network. And the OWN, as we call it, like don't just watch TV, make your own, sort of grew out of the Film and Allied Workers, which was an independent production organization which was concerned with democratizing the airwaves, getting access to SABC, local content issues, commissioning procedures for independent producers. And one grouping within FAWU, Film and Allied Workers, started OWN to try and build community television, to try and take television away from a professional industry into a more grassroots one, or one that was sort of driven by normal South African people and the stories they want to tell. We've had some success. We've set up video access centers in some places. We run quite a few training programs. We've had test transmissions, community access TV test transmission, one in Capetown for 21 days. And more recently, in conjunction with the Right to Communicate conference, the Capetown Community Broadcast Channel. And that's significantly different because it was done in conjunction with this previously state broadcaster, which is now become a public service broadcaster. And so people are using the SABC, South African Broadcasting Corporation facilities and getting support from the corporation and the technicians, but using community people to man the station, making programs about community issues and using community presenters. And there's been this whole tension between engaging the mainstream industry in this way through the window, getting a window on a public broadcaster, or fighting for our own space in the airwaves. And the argument we've had is that there's limited frequency, there's not enough skills, there's not enough resources, there's not enough money in the industry to do this. So we've sort of developed this partnership idea where we're working with the public broadcaster to try and get a sense of what community television is and should be in South Africa. We had, with the democratic transformation came the Independent Broadcasting Authority, who had the task of restructuring the airwaves, relicensing broadcasters. And that brought about over 80 community radio stations, which is a sort of massive advance in the democratizing the airwaves. But the real issue is really, what are they doing? What is their content? How is it different from commercial broadcasting or public service broadcasting? And in reality, it's not that much different. They play a lot of music. People want to be DJs. People want to use the community sector as a stepping stone to being rich and famous. And that, on the other hand, people are developing skills. Communities are getting access to learning skills in broadcasting. But with community television, it's a lot more complicated because of the scarcity of frequencies. Now we have to essentially talk about communities television. We'll share a channel, and from this hour to this hour it'll be the Christians, followed by the Muslims, and then the Hindus, and then we'll have the blacks and the whites and the coloreds, and they'll all share a space in broadcasting. Sounds great in theory. In practice it's a lot more complicated because of the politics of difference that we come from. And we still have quite a long political struggle to go before we can actually share a common resource like a television station, before we can see that we're all part of one community. So the Open Window Network really is trying to build the foundation for that kind of work through providing camcorder access, editing, training, that kind of thing, mainly on VHS, SVHS, what is considered non-broadcasting in this part of the world. And yeah, we've had some success in that direction, but it's very under-resourced. There is some institutional and policy support, but at the moment they're finalizing the broadcast bill, and we're hoping that they'll take the concept of community television a little bit more seriously.
Well, I mean, it seems too, I mean, in post-apartheid South Africa, you know, the difficulties you mentioned, you know, the notion of difference. I mean, that is, of course, becomes a struggle, but that's part of the process. I mean, shouldn't community TV be about those discourses?
Yes, indeed. But I think having come from the community radio licensing, where it was sort of one license per difference, and there's enough scope in community radio broadcasting to provide a station for all these different ethnic and language and racial groups that we have in our country. I think the difficulty is transposing that concept into television, where you can't have one culture, one TV station, one interest group, one TV station. And they've realized that because there was only one legislation that dealt with community broadcasting, and that said you're either a community of interest, a religion or you're a geographical community, you live in a geographical area. But even that in South Africa becomes difficult because geographically people was put in certain areas. So we somehow need to kind of create a space that is shared, and that's difficult for us because we're so used to having everything divided.
Are there any models that you think maybe, of community TV stations that are overcoming that? Or, I mean, do you think there are good models that are working now that should be the basis for the policy?
Yeah. I mean, some of the models we've been looking at is really just on the two ends are a centralized or decentralized model. In a centralized model, you have a shared resource, which would be your playout center, your actual broadcasting station, with a whole lot of pilot community video access centers or production projects that feed into that. The decentralized model locates production activity and decision making in those different community groups, and the playout stations is merely a kind of a machine you put the tape in and push the button. We haven't really had much serious discussion around this. We've presented these ideas to the IBA and we've discussed them within our own forums, but on a policy level, there's still no real consensus around how this will happen, who will fund it, how will people represent communities, which kind of communities would be regarded as being necessary for representation. I mean, one's going to see that again in the whole context of affirmative action, which is something that is part of our process of trying to redress the past. So that gives what people call marginalized or disadvantaged communities preferential access to new opportunities. So it may be that we'll go through that phase before we reach one where it's public, the question of public and the issue and the idea of public and a public space and a public channel, a public access channel is not linked to race or gender, but it is just a facility really for civic action.
Mm-hmm. Is that distinction pretty clear to the people involved and the policymakers, a distinction between commercial and non-commercial, public and private, or do you find it getting blurred?
I think they were quite clear when they started out with the sense of what a public broadcaster should be, and then they created space for commercial free-to-air broadcasters. When they think about community television, that's when they start getting confused, because it is both a public service broadcaster on a local level, in terms of addressing local language and cultural identity and needs. But it is also has to be commercial because it needs to be self-sustainable, and people talk about financing it through local advertising. And the one piece in the bill says that sure, they can raise as much local money and sponsorship as they want, but then there needs to be a limit on their slice of the national pie. So again, it's sort of protecting the public and commercial interests.
Okay, and from a more philosophical standpoint, we just had this right to communicate conference, which is a pretty clear message. How clear do you think that message is understood by, one, the people involved in community communications, and two, in this case, the government that's creating these policies?
Okay, I think South Africa, with its new constitution and new Bill of Rights, is very much in a first phase of understanding human rights and how they are applied in society. And that's a phase of awareness where one kind of promotes, you have the right to this, you have the right to that, you have these freedoms. The other side of that coin is the responsibility. And one could say, the right to express your opinion stops at the next person's ear. And I think that with television, that's particularly relevant in that one can just change the channel. If you don't like what you're watching, you can change the channel. And all these questions around prescriptions on the right to freedom of expression or the right to communicate are, in a sense, unnecessary with new technology, because if people know how to use that technology, then they have the freedom to change. I mean, you can access what you like on the web, and it's a choice you make, and it doesn't infringe upon anyone else's right. So to want to censor the internet is to want to censor what choices people want to make. Obviously, one within a code of conduct. I mean, we have the limitations on the freedom of expression, on no hate speech, no inciting communities to have violence against other people. And in the same way, I think the community broadcasters would take up this right, but the real limitation on that freedom is that will they be able to speak out against dominant political processes and dominant political ideologies. We're in a sort of phase of nation building where people have to try and put the past behind us and become the rainbow nation. It's not that simple, and for a lot of people it's not that simple, and they might want to express that fear and hatred and all of the baggage from the past that we're trying to exhume through truth and reconciliation. And then the killers who come and say they killed so many people with bombs and poison and whatever, just get granted amnesty. I don't think it's that easy to leave the past behind. And so obviously community television, if it's dealing with community issues, is going to come into conflict with dominant government policy, which wants everything to work its way, to work out. So my personal feeling is that there is some concern in government policymakers around having a very powerful medium like television that is not under some sort of political control.
Even with the current, well, I don't want to get into specifics, but
I think the window idea, the idea of having a window within a public broadcaster or having time within another commercial and existing broadcaster, is that subconsciously or even consciously one tries to emulate them, one tries to be better than they are. So we use their styling, their formats, their presentation, and while we may have people with different accents and people who look differently, essentially we do very much the same thing as they do. And really true community television, I think, is breaking that mold of how television looks and how it presents itself, and allowing a much more free space. Because it's both about that freedom of expression, about people given the opportunity to examine their lives and put that in a form that they want to show to other people. Whether or not anyone watches it really doesn't really matter. I think people are driven maybe by thinking they're communicating with other people and their message somehow will touch those other people's lives and get them either to sympathize with their cause or to mobilize them to join their cause. But even if that doesn't happen, I think it's enough that there is that space and that process for people to realize that they can take up that right and that they can find a form of expression. So on the other hand, maybe it is just some kind of pressure valve in the modern society that people feel at least I can get off steam about it.
was there anything you wanted to
No.
add? It's always hard being on the other end, isn't it?